You know, we always like to jump into the most complex, maybe even controversial topics.
Yeah, you could say that. We definitely like to keep things interesting.
Well, and timely too, right?
Yeah.
Like today, we're going to be digging into something that's been making headlines left and right, the USPS, the United States Postal Service.
Right, right. I mean, between those reports of a potential White House takeover, the denials, and then DeJoy resigning, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. And I think it's important to do that, to really understand what's at stake here, because this could have a pretty big impact on, well, pretty much everyone.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. The USPS, it's not just about like sending letters anymore.
Right.
No.
We're talking about voting by mail,
Mhm.
medications, businesses, those packages we're all constantly ordering.
Exactly. But yeah, so we've got a few different sources we're going to be looking at today to try and piece together what's really going on.
Yeah, we've got reports from the Washington Post, CNN, some statements from the White House, and of course, we've got to look into DeJoy's resignation.
Right. Let's dive right in. So, from what we're seeing in the Washington Post and CNN, there's talk of a potential executive order from President Trump.
An executive order to, what, take control of the USPS?
Potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not just like a minor change either. We're talking about maybe firing the entire governing board and putting the USPS under the Commerce Department.
Wow. And that would be under
Lutnick, right?
Secretary Howard Lutnick, yeah. Now, on the other hand, we've got the White House saying these reports are completely false, that there's no such order in the works.
Okay, so right off the bat, we've got some conflicting information here. It's a bit of a he said, she said situation.
It is. And then you throw DeJoy's resignation into the mix, and it gets even more complicated. Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, talk about timing, right? He announces he's stepping down on February 18th, asks the Board of Governors to start looking for a replacement, and then, bam, 2 days later, these reports of a White House takeover hit the news.
You can't help but wonder if the two are connected, right? I mean, was he pushed out? Did he know something was coming?
Exactly. So what do we actually know about his resignation? Why did he step down?
Well, officially, the sources are saying it was voluntary. He wasn't fired or anything like that.
Okay, so not forced out, but maybe encouraged.
It's possible. I mean, his time as Postmaster General has been, let's just say it's been controversial.
Yeah, the mail delays, those cost-cutting measures.
Yeah,
A lot of people weren't happy with those.
definitely. Both Democrats and some Republicans were calling for his removal. Remember that Delivering for America plan?
Oh, yeah, the one that was supposed to fix the USPS's financial problems.
Right. Well, it seemed to cause more problems than it solved, at least in the eyes of many.
So more fuel for that speculation fire, right? Like maybe this resignation is part of a bigger plan.
It's definitely possible. And then you factor in President Trump's previous statements about wanting to privatize the USPS.
Yeah, that's right. He's talked about that before.
So if they're planning a takeover, appointing a new Postmaster General who's on board with privatization would be a pretty strategic move.
Okay, so we've got this potential takeover, a resignation that raises more questions than it answers, and then this whole privatization angle looming in the background.
It's like a political thriller.
It is. And you know what? I think it's time we start talking about what this all means for the average person, for you and me.
Yeah.
Like, what are the stakes here? What happens if the USPS really does change drastically?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Because the thing is, the USTS, it touches pretty much every aspect of our lives in some way.
It's easy to forget about that,
Yeah.
until something goes wrong.
Right, exactly. You don't think about it until you're waiting for an important package or a prescription or, yeah, even that birthday card from grandma.
Exactly. And speaking of packages, about how this could impact LTL shipping, on the surface, it seems like they're pretty separate.
Yeah, you'd think so. I mean, LTL, that's all about those larger shipments, those pallets of goods, right?
Right, while the USPS is handling packages and letters.
Right, right. So not a direct connection there, but,
Yeah.
there could be some ripple effects.
Like what? You think this whole situation could cause businesses to rethink their shipping strategies?
It's possible. I mean, if there are major disruptions with the USPS, especially for those smaller items that are cheaper to ship through them now.
Yeah, businesses might start looking for alternatives.
Exactly. And that could lead to an increase in demand for LTL, potentially.
Huh. Interesting. So even though they operate in different lanes, so to speak, what happens with the USPS could still have an impact on LTL shipping, even if it's indirect.
Right. And I think that actually highlights something really important about this whole situation, how interconnected everything really is.
Like you tug on one thread, And it can have consequences in places you wouldn't expect.
Exactly. And speaking of unexpected consequences, I think we need to zoom out a little bit here and talk about the bigger picture.
What are we looking at?
Well, this whole situation with the White House and the USPS, it raises some serious questions about how our government works. Like if the White House can exert this much influence over the USPS, what does that mean for other independent agencies?
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're talking about potential consequences that go way beyond just mail delivery.
Right. This could set a precedent, potentially shift the balance of power between the different branches of government. It's a much bigger conversation.
Wow, okay. You're right. That is a lot to think about. And honestly, it's a little overwhelming.
It is. And I think in all of this, it's important to remember that, we're not just talking about laws and regulations and political maneuvering. We're talking about people's lives.
Absolutely. We've mentioned potential job losses if the USPS is privatized, but it's so much more than that. These are careers, livelihoods, people who rely on the USPS for their income, their stability.
Exactly. And it's the postal workers, the letter carriers we see every day, the people working behind the scenes to keep this massive system running.
So where do we go from here? What's the next chapter in this USPS story?
Well, one thing to keep an eye on is the USPS Board of Governors. They're not taking this lying down. They've hired lawyers. They're ready to fight back against any attempts to remove them or change the agency's independent status.
They're digging in for a battle.
They are, and it makes sense. They're the ones entrusted with protecting the USPS, and they're not going to give that up easily.
And they have the law on their side, right? That Postal Reorganization Act from 1970.
Exactly. That's a big one. It's the law that transformed the old post office department into the independent agency we know today, and it was specifically designed to shield the USPS from political interference.
So if President Trump does try to fire the board and put the USPS under the Commerce Department, that could lead to a pretty big legal battle.
Oh, absolutely. Legal experts are saying that such a move would almost certainly be challenged in court. That act, it's there to make sure that decisions about the Postal Service are based on what's best for the USPS and its customers, not on political agendas.
Okay, so that's the potential legal showdown. But what about everyday life? Like, will we see immediate changes to how our mail is delivered?
It's hard to say right now. It's definitely a wait-and-see situation, but one thing is clear, the USPS plays a huge role in our lives. It's how we connect with each other, how we access essential services. Whatever happens in the coming weeks and months is going to have a lasting impact on all of that. How we send and receive mail, how we vote, even how we access things like medications.
It's a lot bigger than just putting a stamp on an envelope, that's for sure.
It really is. They've got their legal team ready to go, prepared to defend their position and the agency's independence. And remember, it's not just about protecting the board itself. The Postal Reorganization Act of 1970, that also gives Congress a lot of power when it comes to the USPS.
Like what? I mean, we know they oversee the USPS, but how much power are we talking?
Well, they have the authority to establish post offices and postal routes, for example. So any kind of major restructuring, like putting the USPS under a different department, that would most likely need congressional approval.
So President Trump can't just sign an executive order and call it a day.
Not exactly, no. It could turn into a big constitutional clash, between the executive branch and the legislative branch, a battle over who really gets to decide the future of the USPS.
What about businesses and consumers? One area we haven't talked much about is e-commerce. And our sources are really highlighting how important the USPS is to that whole industry.
It is, yeah. E-commerce relies heavily on the USPS, and it's not just about convenience, although that's definitely a big part of it.
Right. I mean, we all love getting those packages delivered right to our doorstep.
Of course. But
Yeah.
for a lot of small businesses, especially those in rural areas, the USPS, it's more than just convenient. It's their lifeline.
What do you mean?
Well, they rely on the USPS's affordable rates and the fact that they deliver pretty much everywhere to connect with their customers all over the country. A private company, their main focus is going to be profit, right?
Right, the bottom line.
Exactly. So they might not see the same value in serving those more rural areas, those areas that might not be as profitable.
Oh, I see. So those businesses could be left in a tough spot if the USPS changes drastically.
Exactly. And then you think about the impact on consumers. If a privatized USPS decides to focus more on those profitable urban areas, you could see prices go up for everyone else. Delivery times could get longer.
It would create a two-tiered system.
It could, yeah, where people in less densely populated areas end up getting left behind.
So are there any potential upsides to all of this? Could privatization actually lead to some positive changes?
Well, some people argue that it could lead to more innovation, better services.
Really? How so?
Well, a private company, they're not bogged down by government bureaucracy, right? So they might be more flexible, more able to adapt to new technologies, to changing consumer demands.
I see. So instead of just cutting costs and raising prices, they might actually try to improve the customer experience, offer new services to compete more effectively.
That's the idea, yeah. Think about things like package tracking, Sunday delivery, maybe even drone delivery in the future. Those are the kinds of innovations that a private company might be more likely to pursue.
Hmm. Interesting. So there's a chance that privatization could actually lead to a better USPS.
It's possible, but of course, there's also the risk that they'll just focus on profits and forget about serving everyone equally, especially those less profitable segments of the population. It's a complicated issue, no easy answers.
So what should we be paying attention to as this unfolds? What are the key things to watch for?
Well, first, keep an eye on any legal challenges that come up if the White House does try to take over. If President Trump tries to fire the board or restructure the USPS without congressional approval, those legal battles are going to be crucial.
Right. And what about Congress?
Watch how Congress responds. Do they support a takeover or do they oppose it? Do they step in and offer alternative solutions? Their actions are going to be super important in shaping what happens.
And what about DeJoy's replacement? What kind of person are they going to choose for that role?
That's a big one to watch, too. Will they pick someone who wants to keep things the way they are or someone who's ready to make some big changes?
It sounds like we're in for a wild ride.
Yeah.
It's amazing to think that something as, every day as mail delivery can turn into this battleground for political and economic forces.
It really is. But it just goes to show how important the USPS is, how deeply it's woven into American life. And it highlights how interconnected everything is. Decisions made in Washington, they can have a huge impact on businesses, consumers, communities all over the country.
Okay, that's a lot to take in. So we've talked about the legal side, the economic side, but at the end of the day, who really gets to decide? What happens to the USPS? Where does the power lie?
Well, we've talked about Congress, right? They have a huge role to play here.
Right, they oversee the USPS.
They do. They have the authority to pass laws that affect the structure, the funding, how it operates. And remember, the Constitution itself gives Congress the power to establish post offices and postal routes. So if there are going to be any big changes, they're most likely going to need Congress to sign off on it.
So it's not just about what the White House wants.
Right. It's a balance of power. Congress has this responsibility to be a check on the executive branch to make sure any decisions about the USPS are actually in the best interests of the people.
And what about the American people? Do we have any say in this?
Oh, absolutely. Public opinion matters a lot. Lawmakers, they pay attention to what their constituents are saying. They're more likely to listen if they know there's a lot of support for or opposition to a certain policy.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up.
And hopefully we've shed some light on this complex situation, giving you a better understanding of the challenges, the potential consequences, and the power we all have to shape the future of the USPS.
We'll see you next time.